Hi there, this is Carl Irwin with a Blender tutorial. Some of you have been waiting for one of these, and I'm bringing one to you today. This is going to be a follow-up to a project that I'm starting here, a tutorial series that will cross over between a couple of different programs. We're going to be working with LMMS and some other audio software applications to create some music, particularly a musical score. Film score for a short film, just a few minute long film, just a couple minutes of images that we're going to create in Blender. And I'm bringing to you the first installment of the Blender side of this tutorial. The next one probably will alternate back and forth and look at music and look at Blender project files back and forth here as we go through the series. We may double up occasionally when we have larger topics to cover. But this is what we're going to do. We're going to make an animation that we can write some music to in Blender. We're going to use our OpenGL capabilities, our viewport rendering. And we need to use a format or a topic that is easy to do, easy compositing, that doesn't use a lot of system resources, a lot of these really interesting sorts of screen space effects that we have, trying to avoid some of those if we can, but looks good and can subjectively be passed off as photoreal, and gives us a lot of freedom in terms of our creation here. So what we're going to do, and this may turn some of you off, I apologize if that's the case, but we're going to make a space sort of montage, so an outer space kind of montage, space scenes, because that idea seems to fit all of these little requirements that I'm placing on this. When you do space scenes, you can do easy compositing. You can kind of work with just a couple of blend modes, particularly the add blend mode, a little bit of transparency, and much of what you're going to be working with is texture based and photo based, using open photography, the things that have been released to the public domain that we can use to create our scenes. We don't have to use any depth of field. It's not typical to do that because what you're looking at is such a huge expanse. You wouldn't typically have any kind of focus point or focal point that would be obvious and puts other things out of focus. We wouldn't be using ambient occlusion because we're not going to be dealing with a lot of solid bodies near each other. And again, we'll have a lot of freedom in terms of the interpretation of photorealism because, space imagery is very subjective. We have a very limited view of space that's generated from our capabilities to look out beyond our planet and out into the solar system and into the galaxy and galaxies beyond. So we have a very two-dimensional view of space, and that which we create in three-dimensional spaces is very, very subjective in movies. So we can take a lot of freedoms on that, and it'll be okay. And then the last thing is that doing this gives us a great deal of freedom on the musical style, genre, and idiom that we're going to be working with. We can do pretty much anything with a space montage or space scene. We can write music that sits anywhere, on the continuum of styles from Viennese waltz, right, like 2001: A Space Odyssey and that classical music composition score that we saw there, to electronic dance music, and anything in between. So we can really write any kind of music, and I think the goal is going to be on the music end to be very diverse in the textures, orchestration, and types of music. So we're going to do some thematic writing, but we're also going to do a little bit of ostinato writing, repeating patterns, some electronic effects writing, and try to jam in as many different stylistic ideas together in a very eclectic kind of 3 or 4 minute piece. So we'll deal with that when the time comes to it, but that's why we're doing this. So very quickly, just to give you some idea of some of the imagery that we're going to be working on, I have an animation here. This is just kind of an opening little idea here before some titles, and you can see that we have some lights. It's actually very easy to composite that. We'll jump ahead here a little bit. Some more of these light sources, and kind of that Cambrian explosion, Big Bang sort of thing going on there. And we're going to be dealing with some smoke effects that we can create with images and star fields in 3 dimensions in that compositing. Some more of these smoke effects and some more lights. Planets, we'll be dealing with the creation of some planets and very easy ways to texture them, very cheap and easy ways to do it without having to deal a lot with unwrapping geometry. We'll deal again with some compositing of these planets and some of the background space sorts of things that we would see. So a little bit more of a complex planet there. Nebula, creating nebula, again doing all of this in the viewport. So a lot of light effects going on here. So 3-dimensional nebula. Some more here. A lot of this is going to be based on photos. And this is a wormhole kind of thing. We're going to find a way to do this effect right in the viewport using Blender internal OpenGL viewport rendering. And this is actually going to be in version 2.79. So this is not even in Eevee. And let me talk a little bit about Eevee for a moment, because some of you are probably wondering. I mean, this looks pretty good here. We're going to be able to do this, again, right in the viewport on your current install of Blender without having to move forward to the 2.8 branches. Anyway, and we'll even work a little bit on some title creation here. You'll see that in a moment. A little bit on Eevee. We will look into Eevee sometime on this channel. We've already looked into it a little bit in the past on some of the precursors to the Eevee engine. But I want to point out that Eevee, here's a title. We'll work on making a simple title. Eevee is a hardware-dependent engine. Of course, all of them are. They're all hardware-dependent, but Eevee is a forward-looking hardware-dependent engine. It depends on a higher level of OpenGL than what most older computers run on or are capable of on their GPU. It is a little bit more system resource heavy as well in terms of rendering some of the finer elements in real time, but rendering some of those finer elements that you want to have in a more photorealistic OpenGL kind of gamey game back-end, but photoreal front-end sort of rendering, that real-time physically based approximation. We are working with resources that are not very powerful. That's kind of the character and intent of this channel. We have a very hacky channel here. On this YouTube channel, we find ways to make things do things that you wouldn't expect them to be able to do. And I'm reminded of a quote from a fellow by the name of Gene Kranz, and he was made probably most famous in the movie Apollo 13 and the characterization in there. And his quote comes up in a paraphrased form in there. I know he was known to say this, but kind of the statement that's made, that he makes in there, is when they're trying to problem solve. He says, "I don't care what something was meant to do. I care about what it can do. What can it do?" And that's the character and intent of this channel. We are trying to find, hacky ways to make things do pretty extraordinary, quite frankly, bordering on the miraculous, some extraordinary things that it might not be, may not have been meant to do, but it can do these things. And that's kind of the nature of special effects and visual effects and, everything about what we're doing here with not just the visual stuff, but the music stuff too, and virtually rendering a virtual orchestra and symphonic pieces. So that's all I have to say about that. We're going to look at Eevee, but we're not going to spend any time on Eevee in this. There's no need to. We're going to find a way to do this extremely quickly with low resources without having to depend on kind of current or future GPU capabilities, okay? So anyway, that's all I have to say about that. So space scene. Let's take a look at a couple of very basic things. We're just going to make a star field on this one that's 3-dimensional, and we might put a little bit of an element in there like a shooting star or something like that. So let's get into it real quickly. The first thing you're going to need the first thing you're going to need is some pictures, some photographs. And I have a bunch of photographs here that I've downloaded. I actually don't have that many. You don't need that many. I have, let's see, open up a few of these here. So a few images of Nebula, and you want to get onto Google and do an image search for images that are labeled as reuse with modification, commercial or non-commercial, depending on what the intent of your project is. But images that are labeled for reuse with modification should be in the public domain and able to be used for a project like this. Now, you want to check the sources to make sure that the labeling is absolutely correct. But go ahead and download some images. It's probably the easiest way these days to get images rather than getting on dedicated image websites. Google is amazing. You can find anything on the search engine. It gives you a lot of tools to find images in particular. So some Nebula. I have some lens grit and some lens flare images. You can get those the same way online, or if you want to, you can go download a package that I have on BlendSwap called GL Flares and GL Flares 2. If you download those files, you'll also get folders that have images in there, and you can use those without crediting me at all. That's a completely open license. So those are images that were all created by me from scratch. None of those are reused. They're all digitally made. So some lens grit kinds of images we'll use for some of the lens effects. A couple of planets. I think this is Mars. We don't need a full skin. We just need one side. So one hemisphere images. This is actually a melon, so we're going to use this to make a planet, believe it or not. So you can kind of think out of the box in terms of textures. There's a moon, more nebula, so a lot of different, versions of nebula. And some smoke. Some smoke images are very beneficial. So some of this wispy stuff, we can use this to make nebula, and maybe a little bit larger kind of version here for some of the background of our scenes and even some of the foreground kind of space, dust, debris sorts of effects. And let's see, here's some more nebula. And you're going to need one star field, and all of these need to be pretty high resolution because we're going to be zooming in on them. I would, if I were you, download one generic star field, and then I would take it into a photo editor and make it a seamless texture. So this is seamless, so I can duplicate it over and over again on any axis and any plane, and I can have an unlimited expansive star field. So you're going to want one of those. And then, of course, a few lens flare images that you can download from that pack that I pointed to on BlendSwap, GL Flares. So that is something you're going to need. For this project, we're going to just make a star field and put in maybe a shooting star. So let's get to it. We'll go to the top view. Get rid of the default cube, get rid of the light. We're not going to need it. And we will align our camera to view, active camera to view. And we're not going to do any camera projection on this one, although we are going to focus a lot on camera projection on a few of the other tutorials to come. The first thing we're going to do is we need to make a background star field. So let's import an image as a plane. So you go down here to this add-on that you need to add on in the settings, in the properties, and enable this add-on images as planes. And then we can navigate to our image. So I have it in here, space images. And we want to use this one here, the star field. And we want it to be set to shadeless. And we'll use alpha. All these things are already set by default. And we'll import that. And then we need to set this to texture view. And for purposes of what we're doing, although we probably don't need it on this, but particularly when we have things that will need to animate at some point, we want to use GLSL shading mode for our OpenGL capabilities. Let's scale this guy up, and we'll move it back in Z space, so away from the camera just a little bit, and scale it up again. We don't need to duplicate it in any way, and we can go kind of right to the edge of our camera view. And then what we're going to do is we're going to enable this in a very special transfer mode that we can only get to from the game engine. So go to the Blender game engine for a moment, click on the material, and we want to come down here to Alpha Add and add the Add Blend mode. Now the next thing we want to do is we want to set a world environment color. So we're going to go to our world settings and set our horizon color to black. absolute black, and then we'll go to display, and we click on only render in world background. And now what we're seeing is we're seeing an alpha add transparency application of our star field into the background. Okay, what we're going to do now is we're going to duplicate this, and we'll move it forward on Z space, and we'll rotate it slightly on the Z axis, enlarge it just a little bit. Now, here's one tip. We don't want to enlarge our star fields very much. In fact, when we're going to be using other elements inside of our scenes, we're not going to want to have stars at all in some cases. You'll find that in a lot of imagery, particularly when you're looking at a large object in the foreground like a planet, you don't want to have any kind of stars in that scene. First of all, you wouldn't be able to see them, and second, it really makes the shot look less photoreal because of that. The object that you have in the foreground would be setting kind of the light sensor settings on your camera such that you wouldn't see smaller objects. So if you have stars, and we will have some stars in some of those scenes, you're going to want them to be really faint and really, really small and not stick out very much. Okay, so because we're just looking at a star field, we're going to see these stars, but we want them to be pretty small. So if we just render one frame here, we'll see how big it is. We'll go back to our Blender internal render, and we'll set our resolution up to 100%, and I'll render one frame very quickly, and you can see what it looks like. So right here we have a frame of stars, and nothing is too big. All of this looks completely accessible and photoreal. We don't have anything too large sticking out there, and you can see that our scene looks pretty good. So let's go back to the 3D view now. Very simply, what we're going to do is we're going to make a camera move. So we'll select our camera. Now you'll notice that when I select my camera, I can't see through my front image anymore. Now I have a tutorial on the Hacking the Viewport Blender series that I have on my channel that deals with alpha transparency and draw order. This image in the front is out of draw order because we created the background image first. Now, because we're not going to be using a lot of images, we can actually just use Blender's capabilities without having to deal with draw order. If you go over here to the type of active data over here, the object settings, we can select X-ray for the front one. And if we select X-ray, that will make it appear in the front all the time. And I think that might do it. Let me hit camera, and that takes care of our transparency issues. So the other thing that you can use is also the, go back here to my object, you can also select transparency to affect the draw order a little bit. Now you have limitations on this. If you only have a few objects, you can get the order right with your X-ray and transparency. But once you get above 3 or 4 images, 3 or 4 images in your scene, you will find that your X-ray and transparency limitations run out, and you are not going to be able to set your draw order properly just using this. You'll have to actually do a bit of a hack in order to get the draw order right. You can go see that other tutorial in Hacking the Viewport to find out how to do that. So we're all set. Let's make a camera move real quick. We're going to do a 250 frame animation. We will hit I for location rotation on the camera, and then we'll go to the last frame. We will zoom in on the Z axis just a little bit, because again, we don't want these stars to get too big in our field of view. We will hit I again and hit location rotation, and then we're also going to, actually we probably should have put some rotation. I'm going to rotate this on the Z axis until we get to kind of the limits of our visual space there, and we'll hit I again, location rotation, to replace that keyframe. Let's open up another little window down here. We want to open up our graph editor, and everything is automatically selected on our camera move in terms of our F curves. We're going to hit V and select vector to make this a straight movement without any curves. And now if we go back, we can see our camera move in action, and you should notice a little bit of parallax motion. Now we want to maximize this a little bit, and you notice that we might not see a lot of that motion going on, not enough of it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my back plane, my star field that's in the back, and we're going to scale it up quite a bit. Oh, wrong one. Make sure I select the right one. That's not it. Control. Oh, that is it. I'm sorry, I have the right one. Scale this up quite a bit and move it back in Z space. So we'll just give it a little bit more depth. Now, hopefully now when we move our camera, we should notice a lot more parallax motion because of that depth. And you can see that there's a little bit more. Now, if we want to maximize this even more, we probably need to increase the closeness of the forward plane. Let's go to that last frame and fix our sizing here a little bit better. There we go. Okay, so we have our camera move, and this is pretty much done. You can render this out now, all 250 frames. Because it is not a very fast move, we don't really need motion blur, so we don't need to oversample this. We don't need to do any hacks to get motion blur. If you had something moving in there very quickly, you probably would want to. Let's add something moving very quickly. That does not need motion blur. We're going to find a way to put a shooting star in this scene in such a way that we don't need motion blur. We're going to do it in a very hacky way. We love hacky maneuvers. Let's add very quickly just a piece of mesh. We'll put a plane in there, and we're going to tab into edit mode with all the vertices selected. We're going to hit scale S, and we're going to scale it to 0. Hit enter, and let's move this over here to the left side of the camera and go back to the beginning of our animation. And we're going to put a shooting star coming out of this. So what we're going to do is we're going to come over here to the particle settings. We're going to add a particle system that has one particle, a single particle. And we want this to start at, let's say, around 80. And we want it to end at 80. We'll say that the lifetime is 50. That's good enough for right now. And we want to have this emit from the vertices, so it comes from those vertices that are there. And then we want to turn off the normal velocity. We're going to set the x velocity to a positive number, so it goes from left to right. We'll set it to 5, and then we'll set the y to -2. So it's going to kind of come out here at a downward right angle here. And then for the field weights, let's turn our gravity to 0. There is no gravity in space, not that it really matters, and we'll tab out of edit mode there. So we're on our plane, and let's just see what happens. Oh, we need to set something to it. We need it to emit something. So let's select line. We want it to emit a line, and we're going to turn off emitter. Even though it's just a vertice, we can't see it, we'll turn it off so we don't have the emitter rendered in there. So let's see what happens with that. Let's see what we get. So around frame 80, there's our shooting star right there. And let's go to the material settings for our plane, and we'll hit new material, and we'll set this all the way up to white, and we'll hit shadeless. Now because it's a line, it will render, let me go to the camera here, it will render as just a little line that seems to have a motion blur on it, much like what you would see with a shooting star. So let's play this back and see what it looks like. And that kind of goes long, so let's go back to our plane here, and let's change our particle settings a little bit. We're going to increase our velocity. Let's put this up to 8. Put this to -3. And let's decrease the lifetime a little bit. We'll decrease it to 20. Let's see what happens now. There it goes. Okay, that looks a lot better. If we go back to our camera here, you can see what it really looks like. That's it. So for, in the interest of a space montage, this is one scene that's done. Very, very simple. Now, everything that we do from here is going to build on these principles and get more and more advanced in terms of our compositing techniques. But this is something you can render directly from the viewport without any kinds of special extra additive effects. So one thing we want to do is we're going to go to our render slot up here. And we're going to set this to full sample under the OpenGL render options. You can also change it over here. If you select full sample down here, it will render at full sample as well. And then what we're going to do is select AVI JPEG. I know you normally want to render to images, to single images, an image sequence. But because our animations are so short and because we're rendering OpenGL very quickly, it's very low risk. We can render direct to video without having to worry about images, image sequences. The reason why you want to do image sequences is because if there's a mistake, you can go back and start your render over again where the mistake happened, and you still have everything you rendered up to that point. This is going to render so fast, we just don't need to do that. So let's render this out. We'll render this just to our space images here for now, and we'll just call this a shooting star. We'll call it the beauty pass, even though this is really a final render. We'll just put BP on the end there. You want to be organized as well. That's very important. Make sure you're labeling things in a logical way. We'll talk more about organization as we get into this series. And then let's render it out. Now remember, we're going to be rendering using these buttons over here. So not the regular render buttons, but the OpenGL render buttons. Our resolution is at full HD, 100%. We have full sample on and anti-aliasing, and we can go ahead and render this sucker out. And you can see that it renders, about a second per frame. Now, because we're rendering full sample, and because I have a couple of other processes running on here, I'm doing screen capture and audio capture. This is running a little bit slower. Normally, without those other processes on a low-end computer like this, it's just a little laptop, a little ThinkPad. This would render almost real time. Things would zip right along here. So without the extra processes, we would see a much higher speed. We can see our faint little shooting star coming in there. It's so small you barely even see it, but actually you're going to see that that'll show up pretty well in the final. And it's an exercise in subtlety and just being reserved in what you're trying to create. Subtlety is key when you're making animations. You don't want your effects to be too in your face. Keep them kind of simple, and they play a lot bigger and more photorealistic. And we're getting there, about 170 frames. So a little bit about the music stuff while we're waiting for this. I think the next tutorial that we're going to have will be a music one. And now that you've seen the concept of what's going on, we're going to talk about writing themes, thematic writing. You can start writing music without having a full film finished. You can write music for films just knowing what the topic is. In fact, that's a very good practice to start your music writing, just knowing what the topic of the film is and being able to write some themes and some general ideas based on that alone that you can draw from later. So that's what our focus is going to be on in our first music tutorial. And I think we're done now. Let's go to the video sequence editor and just see what this looks like. I'm going to add our movie back in. We'll go to our where we saved it, shooting star, beauty pass, BP. And I like to work this way, setting up my properties tab over here where the graph editor is at, or the curve editor, and we'll keep all the settings the same. Let's just see if we can improve this a little bit. Let's add, let's take away a little bit of the saturation. So right on the track, we'll take the saturation down to 0.9, just take away a little bit, and we'll add an adjustment layer. See if we can kind of darken up the darks a little bit. Let's add a modifier, a curves adjustment, and we're going to take the reds and we're going to take them down a little bit and bring the reds up on the upper channel. So down on the lows, up on the high, brings a little bit more of an orangey pop to the light colors. And then on the contrast curve, we'll take the low ends down just a little bit to bring up the contrast. And let's see what that looks like when we get over to our shooting star. And you can see it play out there very faintly in the background. So someone who's watching this scene play out will notice that. Let's go back and hit play. Then let's hit on the playback. We'll hit frame dropping so we can see it all come out. Not that we need AV sync, but we will later, so we just get in the habit of doing that. And we hit play. And you can see that shooting star. Even though it's doing frame dropping, that shooting star sticks right out. And that's it. That's the scene. Very, very simple. So we can render this again. And what we would do is we would render this as the final pass. And once you're in the video sequence editor, you can use the regular render buttons or you can use the OpenGL. It doesn't really matter. Again, you want to make sure that full sample is selected and anti-aliasing. I'll just hit the render button, the OpenGL button over here. It'll render out pretty quickly. And then you have your final animation. So That in a nutshell is how we're going to start this project, this space scene, this montage of different images, and we'll explore how we can create more of these things, these different scenes in the viewport, rendering OpenGL, rendering quickly, and trying to get as photoreal as we can, make a really exciting kind of highly visual scene that we can write some music to ultimately in the end. That's what we're trying to do. Write some epic music at the end of this. So anyway, that's all I have for you today. I hope that you find this useful. A little bit of recap on some of these techniques that we've seen in the past from my channel here. Just trying to employ the things that we know in new and interesting ways. Let's see, let's find this real quick. So we have this is our final scene. You can see that parallax motion, and there goes our shooting star, and there's a scene. So that was pretty painless and got put together pretty easily using just an image that we found that was open source online. Yeah, fun stuff. So space scenes and space music, more to come. I hope that you find this useful, and I wish all of you happy blending.